Grace and mercy and peace are yours from God our Father and through our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Today we conclude our sermon series, Proud to be a Church Member. And just like last Sunday, we look at two sections of Scripture for that. First of all, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, and then 2 Corinthians 9, verses 7 through 8. In both of them, Paul says, now about the collection for the Lord's people, do what I told the Galatian churches to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. And then in 2 Corinthians, he says, each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves cheerful giving. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. Dear brothers and sisters in the Savior, when we are proud of something, it's only natural for us to support it with our money. Wouldn't you agree? For example, it used to be in this country that if people were proud to be an American, they sought to buy American-made products. And I don't think that pride has really disappeared from our country. I think it's just moved down a couple of levels. These days, we show pride in our local communities. For instance, by shopping more at small businesses than we do at large, big box retail companies. Or if you are proud of your child's club or high school sports teams, you're willing to pay an admission price and attend every game. You're willing to purchase the team apparel and wear that, too. If you are proud of your young child's work ethic, you might even invest in their fledgling business for their company. For example, I have 3 nephews over in Wisconsin, young nephews, who a couple of years ago decided they wanted to start a neighborhood business. And my brother wanted to encourage that, so he paid for their first round of business cards and their first round of advertising flyers. And now, the Bodie Boys pet sitting service earns about $750 a year. Plus, they are willing to water plants for neighbors while they're away on vacation. The point is that my brother wanted to encourage that attitude, that work ethic in his boys, and so he spent some money towards it. That same concept or principle can also apply to the last sermon in our series, Proud to be a Church Member. When we are proud of our church, we're going to naturally support it financially, aren't we? Let's always remember, though, that when we have pride and joy and delight in our church, it's not to be so much about the building and grounds or the church programs or the people or the pastor, but our pride and joy and delight are in the Lord, the church. In the first sermon of this whole series, we talked about how God was pleased to make us members of the Holy Christian Church by faith in Jesus Christ. And so he brought us and made us part of a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and a people belonging to God. What an amazing thing, huh? That God would take delight and pride in us, his redeemed people. Then in turn, we want to show our pride for God, pride in God, by obeying his word and joining a Bible-believing congregation and gathering together with fellow brothers and sisters regularly around God's word and sacrament. That is sometimes what we call our stewardship of God's temple or stewardship of God's truth. We talked about that 2 Sundays ago. Then last Sunday we considered our stewardship of our time and talents in support of our congregation. Today we want to talk about the last T of our stewardship, the use of our treasures. In faith, we are proud to support our church with our offerings. The collection that the Apostle Paul mentions in the last chapter of 1 Corinthians was not the regular collection of member offerings that they took every Sunday during the service. Instead, this collection was a collection for God's people, fellow Christians down in Jerusalem who were suffering under a severe famine at that time. Paul encouraged the Corinthians, just like every other congregation that he had founded in the Galatian region, to put their money where their Christian minds and mouths and hearts were. He encouraged them to show Christian love, to take this special offering or collection as a way to aid the relief of their Christian brothers and sisters down in Jerusalem. Paul gave them specific directions about how to collect the offering so that when he came into town, everything was ready to go. But while he was really talking about a special offering in giving these instructions, Paul at the same time was laying down some biblical principles that still today guide our regular Christian giving. The first biblical principle that guides our Christian giving is to plan it out beforehand. He says in that first lesson, on the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money. In other words, we are to decide on and then designate our offering even before we leave the house for church on Sunday morning. That advanced action shows that we care and are concerned about God's will for our entire lives, not just the hours that we're in the worship service. By that we recognize that God cares for us during those other hours of the week as well. Plus, his instruction to give on the first day of every week kind of lines up with what God told his believers back in Proverbs chapter 3. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of your crops. In the Old Testament, when it came time to harvest the crops, God commanded his believers to bring the first portion of the harvest to him at the temple as an offering, before they decided what portion they were going to keep for their own families, and before they decided what portion they were going to send to market to earn a living wage. And in this way, they honored the Lord and his promise to take care of them. Likewise, today we honor the Lord by picking out a portion, a first fruits portion that is going to go to the Lord. Before we pay things like the mortgage and the rent bills, utilities, gas, groceries, or just entertainment. On the flip side of the coin, we dishonor the Lord whenever we pay for those other things first and give God the leftovers, or nothing at all, because there might not be anything left over after we spend the entire paycheck. That instruction to give on the first day of every week also plays into what is considered to be consistent or periodic giving. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income. Overall, we have to remember that our giving is part of our worship to God. Right alongside our regular attendance and attention, our communing and praying and singing together on Sunday mornings. Every week we gather together before God to thank him for another week of his providence and protection. And our offerings are part of that worship to him. Moreover, there's also a practical aspect to this consistent or periodic practice of giving. Just like in our own families, our congregation has some regular bills that have to be paid periodically, like for the mortgage, or mortgage retirement, or for a new building. They have to pay bills for utilities, so that you don't have to get on your snowshoes to get across the parking lot and into the building. Or so that we can pay for heat, so that you don't have to sit here for 2 hours dressed in your coat and hat and gloves. We have to pay for things like salaries and office equipment, so that we can have worship folders and Bible studies, and so that we can have outreach materials to spread the word to our community as well. Whether you give weekly or bi-weekly or even monthly, God says consistent, periodic giving is a good thing. It's one of his principles for giving. Who should give then? Each one of you, Paul says. Every Christian should be involved in giving to the Lord. The Bible doesn't know anything about this assumption that only rich people who can afford it should give financially, and those who don't have that much money are exempt from giving financially, but they can give in other ways. The Bible doesn't know anything about that. On the contrary, rich King David gave gobs and gobs of money for the establishment, the building of the temple in Jerusalem. And centuries later, a poor woman came along and put in 2 small coins to support the temple and its ministries. And God was pleased with both offerings because they came from a heart, 2 hearts that recognized their dependence on God. Even children can give to the Lord. If they're very young and don't have an income of their own yet, parents, grandparents, let them put your offering into the plate to teach them that our giving is part of our grateful response to God. Or, when they're a little bit older and get their first job, sit down with them and help them decide what portion of their paycheck they're going to give to the Lord. That's what my brother did with his 3 boys when they got their first job. God willing, when Evan gets his first job this summer, that's one of the first things we're going to do as well. The big question on all our minds, though, how much should I give to the Lord? Well, he does not specify a particular dollar and cents amount. Instead, he guides our giving with these words. He said, set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income. In other words, God calls us to look at our entire income. If we're single, our own income. If we're married and both people are working, that joint income as well. Take a look at that entire income and then decide what first fruits portion you want to give to the Lord. His Old Testament people did not have that luxury. They didn't have that freedom. In the Old Testament, God commanded his people to give a tithe, a 10% of everything they had. That included their money, their crops and fruits, their flocks and herds, all of it. 10%, no more, no less. Still today, there are many churches out there that teach God tells us to tithe, to give 10%. But they'd be wrong. Because God tells us we are free to decide which percentage of our entire income we want to give to him. How does that work, though? What does it look like? Well, just an example. Let's say, for instance, that you earn $41,800 annually. That means your weekly paycheck would be $800. If you choose to give 12% of that income, your weekly offering to the Lord would be $96. If you choose in Christian freedom to give 10%, naturally it would be $80 per week. If you choose in your Christian freedom to give 8%, it would be $64 per week. Again, God reiterates you are free to do that. He says the same thing as Paul did in the first lesson. Through the second lesson, he says, each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give. God gives us that freedom for our giving. Finally, Paul instructs us to give not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Maybe you've heard some pastors or even churches say, the Lord wants you to give until it hurts. I know what they mean, and maybe they have good intentions, but God never calls us to give in a way to him that is going to hurt our families financially, that's going to hurt us financially. Remember, he's given us that freedom. He doesn't call us to give reluctantly or under compulsion, negative compulsion, like guilt over our sins and how we can give to make up for those things. He doesn't call us to give under the negative compulsion of, hey, I got to do this to keep up with the other members in my congregation. Or under the negative compulsion of church leaders who say, you must give this much. This is what God says. No. God loves the cheerful giver. The Greek word that is translated cheerful in this lesson, that's the word that we get our English word hilarious from. God wants wants us to give hilariously, with the joy and pride and delight that any gift given to his glory or for the people around us, that's a good thing. God wants us to take delight and happiness in that. So, does your attitude and actions about giving to the Lord, do they match up with these principles that God has given in these two lessons? Do you decide beforehand what portion of your income you're going to give to the Lord? And do you give a percentage of your income cheerfully, gladly, and consistently? If you're like me, you realize that we've got some room to grow in these areas. We fall far short of God's commands for us. But if we're God's chosen and holy and dearly loved people, why does that happen? Why do we so often not give like he says? It's because each one of us still has a very powerful sinful nature or old Adam in us that is not going to take pride in God or his word or his people. That sinful nature is only going to take pride in itself and its sinful desires. So, when God tells us to give a first portion of our paycheck to him, the sinful nature is going to say, no, I think month after month after month, I'm going to continue to spend it on the necessities of life, and I'm going to put God last. When we do pick a percentage of our income to give to the Lord, the sinful nature in us is only happy and gleeful to miss a few Sundays, but then not make up those offerings and still say, well, I gave according to the Lord's principles. I gave a percentage. If you're not making that up, you're not coming even close to the percentage that you in Christian freedom chose. Or when the sinful nature hears he's freed us from that law of the tithe, the sinful nature goes, sweet. That is so wonderful. Then I can give whatever I choose, as little as I choose, maybe even nothing if I choose to do so. That's not faith talking. That's the sinful nature. And whenever we give, whatever we give, the sinful nature, you almost have to pry it out of its hand. It is going to be grieved because it says, what a shame, what a waste. That money could be used for something so much better than this. So how does the holy God react to all our stubbornness and selfishness? Thankfully, exactly the opposite of what we would expect. He says in John chapter 3, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. God's incomprehensible love for sinners like you and me led him to give his best. His holy, eternal Son, who took on human body and human soul so that he could take the physical and spiritual punishment that we deserve for our sins. God planned this out even before the creation of the world, even before the fall of sin. So how did the holy, eternal Son react to that eternal plan? Not reluctantly. He didn't do it under compulsion. He did it cheerfully. Hebrews chapter 12 says, for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God. Even though the Son of God knew it was going to cost him a lot of pain and suffering and sorrow, Jesus was thrilled to die on the cross and pay our debt of sin so that by faith in him, one day we could sit with him in the eternal glories of heaven. Christ's love compels us to show our love for him, to worship him. Christ's love also compels us to take pride in him by obeying his commands to give a first fruits percentage of our income and give it cheerfully, gladly, consistently, and generously. But if we give according to the Lord's principles, what is going to keep us from those doubts that we're not going to have enough to live on for ourselves? Not to keep on going back to God's promises. If God gave us his best in Jesus, how can we not expect him to give us the rest? Everything we need for our body and life, all eternity. He says in this second lesson, God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. I've got a challenge for you this morning. If, as we've gone through these principles for Christian giving, you found that you're not giving according to those principles, one or more of them, commit yourself to doing it for a shorter period of time. Let's say 6 or 8 or 10 weeks. And then see if you lack anything. God promises you will not. In fact, he says through the prophet Malachi, test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be enough room to store it. The Lord's gracious and faithful promises to us in Christ Jesus, that's what makes us proud, not only to be a member of a church, but proud to be a member of the church, the Holy Christian Church. In faith, may we not only give good stewardship of God's truth in our church, give of our time and talents and treasures to support our church, but may we learn to practice whole life stewardship, using all that God has made us and all that God has given us for his glory and for the people